So one of the other trends that we're seeing here is also the whole FIRE movement, financially independent, retire early, which is a concept that, at least when I was setting up my savings 15 years ago, when I spoke to my bank, that concept, it probably existed, but it was not something that my bank spoke about. Maybe because it's not in the interest of banks for us to be financially independent. But nevertheless, that is a movement that is very, very trending right now. And basically it is boiled down to how can you become financially independent before you're 40 years old, which requires obviously a lot of savings. It requires a completely different view on spending, on wealth management as well. But that is not something that traditional banks speak about.
Right.
So that is something that you hear about or read about on social media, but the incumbent banks don't use it as something which could be of value to both parties. People want to be financially independent from the financial system. There's a us versus them culture, which to a certain extent I can understand.
Ramtin, thank you so much for coming down to Copenhagen. It's great to see you here.
Thank you.
So, Ramtin, please tell us who you are and what you do.
Yes, so I work as the head of innovation for Sparebank 1 SR-Bank. It is the second largest regional bank in Norway. We have approximately 220 billion in gross lendings and 350,000 retail and corporate customers. And we are present from the west, Bergen and Stavanger, to Oslo in the east and on the southern shores of Norway. Yeah.
Right. Okay, and I know as head of innovation, you have your hands in a lot of different pies. Today we're going to be focusing a little bit on the democratization of financial services side. So let's start by talking about what's democratization, what's happening and what's driving it.
So the democratization of wealth management is basically trying to create a even playing field for everyone in society, basically. Historically, there's been an uneven playing field where people who have had wealth basically have had opportunities to invest and grow that fortune or wealth in different types of instruments that previously have not been accessible to everyone. And I think given the past, let's say 5 years, there's been a paradigm shift towards trying to make those instruments available to the broader part of public, fueled by technology, distributed ledger technology, blockchain, crypto, for instance, is a good example of how can I say, common people can invest in instruments which are highly lucrative. Obviously there's a risk, but they're highly lucrative over time, and actually give them the possibility to grow their fortune as well. So that is the technology part is actually making it more accessible for you and me to actually go and invest in these types of instruments as well. We also see that there's been a focus on trying to, a fairness, a purpose in the way that you invest. We see that younger generations are very focused on having a purpose, and the fact that there's been some events, mainly related to certain companies like GameStop, where there's been a sense of unfairness towards the broader public and investment funds, hedge funds, who have a very specific strategy on how they want to invest, where we have seen that people have basically joined forces in actually trying to even out that playing field, and that type of events and the whole mindset behind it is basically what is trying to fuel the whole democratization of wealth management.
Right, and is there is this driven more by an opportunity that technology is bringing about, or is there a problem at the core of this that this is trying to solve?
Oh, that is a very good question. I think there's a root cause here, which is I think it's quite obvious to see, where there's an inequality of the access towards this type of instruments. Another example could be, for instance, equity raising for startups. You have a lot of startups here in Copenhagen FinTech Lab. How do you actually get on the investor side of those?
Right.
That's not possible unless you are a family office, you have some type of wealth, connections to be able to actually invest in these companies. Right. But a lot of the value creation actually happens from when the startup is in its very infant phase and moves to a scale up, and from there onwards maybe to getting noted on the stock exchange.
Right.
But how do you actually access that? And that is part of the inequality, which some companies are actually trying to solve.
Right, and you mentioned that there's also newer generations that are coming with bigger expectations. My question is, why is this happening now? Is there any other drivers in the market that are causing this to be the perfect storm that brings about this change?
I think it's a composed trend that we're seeing with a lot of different factors. So this is not an exhaustive list, but at least it covers the main basic points, in my opinion. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has something to say in all this. There was 2 years where a lot of people were laid off, and the need for alternate income streams for personal households became evident, that you need to actually be able to get an income from somewhere. So a lot of people actually research how can I set up parallel revenue streams where platforms like Robinhood, actually plays an important role in actually trying to understand how this world actually works. So that is one part of it. The second one was actually, as you mentioned yourself, the purpose-driven investment side, trying to even out the playing field. But also the technology, as we briefly talked about, because we haven't had that type of access to instruments before. The syndication, for instance, of high-value assets. There are companies that work with the syndication of real estate. So if I want to buy a real estate by the waterfront here in Copenhagen, that's obviously out of my league. But if there are instruments there that can syndicate that type of asset for me to buy a share of it, that makes it interesting. And there are companies who actually work with this and actually try to provide it. One of the other trends that we're seeing here is also the whole FIRE movement, financially independent, retire early, which is a concept that, at least when I was setting up my savings 15 years ago, when I spoke to my bank, that concept, it probably existed, but it was not something that my bank spoke about. Maybe because it's not in the interest of banks for us to be financially independent. But nevertheless, that is a movement that is very, very trending right now. And basically it is boiled down to how can you become financially independent before you're 40 years old, which requires obviously a lot of savings. It requires a completely different view on spending, on wealth management as well. But that is not something that traditional banks speak about. Right. So that is something that you hear about or read about on social media, but the incumbent banks don't use it as something which could be of value to both parties.
And what do you think is driving this movement?
I think it is partially. I think it is due to, again, the sense of inequality. People want to be financially independent from the financial system. There's a us versus them culture, which to a certain extent I can understand.
Right. Very interesting. If we talk about democratization and about this being the right time to introduce this product to market, I know that in your experience working on a bank, you also sit in the board of several companies that are bringing these new products to market. What would you say is the main challenge of introducing a product to a market where there hasn't been a demand for that product in the past, especially when making it accessible to the mass market?
I think to some extent it contributes to a polarization in the market. On the one hand, you have the incumbent banks, which provide classical investments in funds, stocks, and so on, which kind of have had if you look at the different social media investment sites on Reddit and so on, you see that they have a kind of a tainted reputation. Don't trust them. And on the other side, you have this more of a fair approach on how you can do this, investment in these type of instruments. So introducing that type of tools might kind of fuel that polarization. Where should I put my money? Should I trust the bank, which I've had a customer relationship with for the past 10, 20 years? I trust them. But here on the other side, there's a lot of new companies, fintech companies, who are providing me an alternate service, usually cheaper, better designed, great UX, but do I actually trust them?
Right.
And that is one of the positions that the incumbent banks have had for a very long time, trust, which is a key element in the business model. And that is just something that takes time. So yeah.
Right, and I think if we look at the past 20, 30 years, there's always been this move towards getting people on what they call the property ladder, because that's a way in which they can build wealth and then increase their wealth over time. Now we hear a lot of talk about getting people on the investment ladder through democratization. Now my question to you is, why would a customer choose investment over equity on property, or what's the advantage of choosing these new type of services that are being democratized?
That is a very good question. Obviously, I'm not a financial advisor, so but I think it's important to have some type of diverse portfolio. But there are some advantages towards these types of tools, which basically brings down the barrier for entry, basically. We've known that, at least here in the Nordic countries, that the housing market has been soaring the past, at least 2 years. Maybe partially fueled by the boredom of people. They couldn't travel, they couldn't buy stuff, they couldn't go out. So what they do, they renovate and sell and buy houses, right? But that increases barriers for new entrants. So if you're a young couple who wants to settle, buy an apartment, it's difficult to get into the market. So, sure, you should get into the property ladder if it's possible, but the democratization of the wealth and the savings could become a stepping stone towards that. But inherently, there is risk there as well. So actually, a good example is there are companies who actually work with a company local in Stavanger, Norway, who's actually working with making it more accessible for younger couples or people to get into the housing market by providing some of the equity for getting in. And that is also a part of democratization, right? Because people who have been investing in the housing market the past 20 years, they don't have a problem with selling and buying. But if you haven't done that before, how do you actually get in? So there's some interesting thoughts on how actually the democratization, not only on wealth, but in general in investments and savings, is actually a very, very broad topic. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize, all right, there's actually a movement here which is quite interesting. And a lot of these fintech companies are actually providing services there, which is a solution to a societal issue. Because for people not being able to get into the housing market, that is a societal issue.
Now, I think that brings me nicely into my next question, which is, if we are democratizing the entire spectrum of services within wealth management, there's of course lots of different areas where we could start with. What, in your opinion, are the low-hanging fruits that could be addressed first within wealth management?
I think insights and knowledge is quite important. During the pandemic, we saw there was a lot of younger people moving into the stock market. Mm-hmm. What they saw at that point was interest rates that were going down. There was a lot of hype around, parallel income, you should invest. There was a demand for that type of services, which basically increased the stock market and the investment appetite in general. Mm-hmm. Now we have kind of moved past that. And I believe that today we're seeing a market in general that behaves a bit more naturally, mm-hmm. because what we had before was not, in my opinion, quite natural.
Right.
So I think a lot of people have suddenly gotten a wake-up call, like, oh wow, the stock market isn't always going up. It's also going down. Yeah. Which kind of spooks a lot of people, I think. And we know that being invested in the stock market is a patience game. Mm-hmm. But if you're a young investor, you haven't actually realized that things can go down. There are bad times as well, and you don't have the appetite to actually be in the stock market. That could impact your wealth in a negative way. Mm. But how do you combat that? You combat it by having insights, understanding how these type of things work. So one of the low-hanging fruits, in my opinion, is to trying to educate and make people understand how these types of things works, which is, in my opinion, also part of the democratization of wealth. You need to understand how the underlying mechanism, industries, instruments, and how the macroeconomy actually works. So yeah. All right, and I think if we look at wealth management, as we mentioned before, it traditionally was inaccessible to certain parts of the population, mainly because it's a very high touch type of service that requires an advisor, that requires a lot of time being spent on a particular portfolio. Now, as technology is bringing down those barriers and is automating a lot of those functions, in your opinion, do you think that investment companies and banks will continue to optimize the physical channel, or is this going to be a replacement by technology? That is an extremely good question, and there's these two things are usually put aside as two opposites. Mm. You have the physical channel in the one, the old school incumbent banks who have financial advisors. You get in, sit in a chair, drink some coffee, and you kind of discuss how your portfolio should be set up. Yeah. And on the other hand, you have digital channels where you just do everything online, and maybe you have a chatbot who can advise you on certain areas. Roboadvisor is an area that we see is really increasing in at least Norway, but also here in Copenhagen. We have Noah Investments who are in the house here who does a lot of that. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's a question of either or. I think there's room for both. I believe that we need to develop the physical channel still. Mm. A lot of younger generations who have spent a lot of time behind the screen, what we see is that when we actually, as an incumbent bank, bring them into the chair and they discuss eye to eye, we see that they actually prefer that because they need the validation, they need the check mark that, all right, a professional has looked over their economy. Mm-hmm. This is going to be fine. We have this under control. You don't get that type of trust building foundation with digital tools yet. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of pointing back to what I was talking about earlier, that it takes a lot of time to build that type of trust. And I think it's easier when you're sitting across one another rather than interacting with a screen. Mm-hmm. Which is something I think is a question for a lot of the new fintechs, for instance. A good question, how does Noah Investment build trust? Mm-hmm. Because people are pouring their savings into this, right? Yeah. I think it's much easier for Danske Bank or Nykredit or some other to build trust when we're sitting across each other and people are saying, this is going to be fine. Mm-hmm.
Right. And maybe just to close, what would you say are the main opportunities that democratization of wealth management is opening both for investment companies and for customers?
I think there's a possibility here for achieving some type of synergy between these two. I think a lot of investment companies want to use the whole hype around this. I think it's possible for them to invest in a lot of the tools. They have a lot of the knowledge and the trust. They have a lot of the distribution network as well. And we know that fintechs and those who provide the tools for the democratization actually have the possibility to make it accessible. And this is one of the things that I've been speaking about earlier as well, is that the fintech companies lack the trust and the distribution network, but the incumbents have the trust and the distribution network.
Yeah.
So why not collaborate on those two areas? Because I think it's a match made in heaven, so to speak. But it requires that each party actually gives a bit of the business model and actually try to understand one another. Because I think both parties are there's a lot to earn by being able to provide a collaboration towards the end user here, because that is ultimately the goal here, to provide better services for everyone equally.
Right. And if I may, just one last question. If you look forward 3 to 5 years, how do you think the market would look once this democratization trend is no longer a trend and goes mainstream?
I hope that a lot of the new services provided by the fintechs are able to build that trust that we've been talking about. This is something that takes years. It is not done next week, or it takes a lot of time. We just saw Norway Investment passing 2 billion Danish kroner in asset under management. Right. So obviously they're moving in the right direction, and hopefully we will see a world where the incumbent banks also have understood that, all right, we need to rethink this. We can't just provide investments for the wealthiest in society. We need to rethink how we can do this for the mass market on a platform and with a pricing that is accessible for a lot of people. Because we see what a lot of the fintech companies are providing is a much cheaper platform.
Right. All right, with that, well, we thank you so much for coming down.
Thank you, Chris.
It's been really interesting hearing your insights, and
likewise.
And of course, we're very much looking forward to also hearing you at Nordic FinTech Week in September.
Yes, looking much forward to it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks very much.